beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of Dubai. When you are born, your parents pay nothing. Your delivery and checkups for the next 9 months are all free. Then you grow up and you go to school. Local school in Dubai is free. And so are universities, because Dubai will pay for you to get a degree.
I studied at Zayed University and New York University, both for free.
Who's gonna pay for that?
The government.
Then you get married. If you can't afford the wedding, you get $20,000 to throw a wedding. And after marriage, every local Dubai family gets this: free land. Did you get free land?
Yes.
Did you get free land?
Yes.
Did you get free land?
Sure, yes.
And if you cannot afford the home, then you get a grant to build it for free.
I also can't afford building a house. I can get a 0 interest loan on housing.
Zero?
0.
If you need to go to the hospitals are free. And if you need surgery that's not available here, they will fly you to another country to get treatment for free. When you become a senior citizen, you get discounts, many discounts. And if you live alone and can't afford it, Dubai will even send a caretaker to look after you for free. And when you die, well, in Dubai, that's also free. Your funeral will be taken care of, and Dubai will build a full tent with air conditioning within 5 hours of your death next to your home, so your friends can come and say goodbye to you.
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
Well, good evening to you, and welcome to this program of Globespan this evening, special program focusing on the ethnic relations, budget, social and developmental impact. And to discuss this topic this evening are some of the usual faces here, Dr. David Hinds, Mr. Ravi and Dr. Terrence Blackman. Co-host for this evening is Mr. Vishnu Bisram. And so we'll be talking about the Guyana 28-23 budget. Welcome to the program, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you for.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Vishnu, Mr. Bisram is going to lead off this evening's discussion. So I'll hand you over to him so that he can.
Before I pose any question, I watched the budget, some of it anyway, the budget debates, and I was struck by the tone of the debate, the way in which both sides spoke down at each other. There seemed to be so much disrespect in giving their views across, and I wonder if the panelists would like to address that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're speaking of ethnic relations, it is something that we should address. Professor Blackman?
Well, yes, I too, like you, watched a number of the presentations in the Parliament, and I definitely thought that some of the tone was not in the arena of. There was much more, as I would see it, a kind of showboating rather than a real sense of, trying to solve the problems of Guyana and to think in terms of, the budget and its alignment with national priorities and, how resources were allocated. It seemed like, we did this and you did that, and there was not a sense there from the discussion that there was any real attempt at, or really an attempt to sort of find some common place. And actually, that was one of the points that I kind of wanted to kind of raise this evening in terms of, the public participation in the shaping of the budget. I just felt that it seemed like this was something that was done someplace, and perhaps with good reasons, and the logic would be clear, and we can talk about the specific elements. But I felt that it didn't seem like a national debate around, how this budget aligned with, in a broad sense, Guyana's national development priorities. So yes, this was something that I noted, and I made note to kind of interject into our conversation. So I'm glad that you raised this at the very beginning.
And the others, Ravi Dev, and then David Hinds.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the tone is continuously very, very acrimonious. And we have long spoken of the need for some form of civility in terms of the discourse between those who are contesting for power. But I think that part of the reason for this descent into invectives and
I've just lost you.
Yeah, we have lost Ravi.
Lost the sound.
Okay, so let's move on to Professor David Hinds from Arizona. Professor, what's your take about the tone?
Well, I'm from Guyana. I work in Arizona. No, I agree with my colleagues here that the descent into that raucousness that we see in Parliament is more than a cause for worry. I think the genesis of it has to do with the fact that our politicians no longer make a distinction between campaign and governing. And that for me is extremely worrying, because it's one of the basic things about politics that any young political activist must learn. And then the second thing is I want to draw from a calypso by the late, great Dr. Leroy Calise, who just passed away, the Black Stallion, who in one of his calypsos said, "I do sing for the land and then the man." The prioritizing of nation and country before party is something that I think is lacking in our political culture, that our politicians have lost the art of being a member of your party without losing the essence of what it means to be a Guyanese, to be a Caribbean person, and that the party has become so overbearing that the party has become an end in itself. So that arena is no longer National Assembly. It's two parties in their party headquarters throwing dead dogs across at each other. I think it's a sad deterioration of our politics at the top, but I think it has also become reflective of the way our discourses are conducted in the country as a whole. And for me, it is not just a deterioration of politics, it's really a deterioration of discourses in our country. And I wonder whether our politicians see themselves as human beings, engage in discourses that have to do with our humanity. When I listen to that thing in Parliament, there's no soul. There's no soul in the politics. There is no humanity in the politics. And when you lose your soul and you lose your humanity, you end up with that. You end up with that. And I don't say that what, but you end up with that. I think it's, I don't see how you can transform a society when the agents or the potential agents of transformation are not able to allow themselves to be human beings. Allow themselves to be human beings. They're robots who are talking to themselves, and in the end, hope they will talk to voters, not human beings.
Ravi, you want to continue in response to both Professor Hinds and Professor Blackman?
Yeah, I guess only Deon and I are in what I see Devin had posted, that we are the new Dubai. So it would appear that we're not quite right there yet, because my electricity was interrupted momentarily, which knocked out my internet system, which knocked me out. So I think somebody called it Dubai. So Dubai isn't quite there yet. But be as it may, I return to the question, and I assume that David had spoken to that. I heard the last fag end of David's point. And I was going to say that, yes, there's this lack of civility, and there's many factors that goes into that, this callousing, not only of our moral fiber, but as to how we look at each other and react to each other. But in addition to all of that, I think one of the problems with Guyanese politics is that we have discarded a framework for analyzing what we are doing. So, for example, when we were to have looked at the PNC's budget of the 70s, which was called, the theme was Feed, Clothe, and House the Nation. That was based on a particular set of premises, call it the socialist premises, if you will. So when there were debates in Parliament, both sides could disagree, but they had a framework as to what they are discussing. So whether they could say, well, we should not or we cannot feed, the assumption was that, yes, both parties agreed on the need to feed the nation, clothe the nation, and house the nation. So that at least brought in some order. What we have here now is that after the fall of socialism and that whole by 1989, we accepted upon the IMF diktat the neoliberal premises of how the world is structured, especially economically. So the point is, though, we have accepted it, but never spoken openly about the premises. Neither party wants to talk about the premises of neoliberalism, which, for example, is based on market fundamentalism. So when I guess tonight, most of us will talk about what is the distributive impact or effect of the budget. All budgets are supposed to have a distributive effect. Unlike socialism, from each according to his work to each according to his work, whatever that was. The point is, in neoliberalism, it's left to the marketplace, supply and demand, to make these choices, when some of us are saying, hey, These are some moral choices. Should we have people starving here while you have plenty there? But in not stating the premises, I think there's a certain amount of frustration, and they're not talking to each other. They're talking at each other because the premises could be wrong. Of recent, I have heard that the PPP accept, to Ralph Ramkaran's consternation, that they're a capitalist party or some such formulation. I think David and him had a colloquy on that. But the point is, how far does that go? How far does that go? What are some of the socialist premises that still imbue our Constitution? Are they of any relevance? So I want to put that, I want to put the budget then in that perspective, that if we are to have any hopefully productive discussion, we ought to talk about, well, what do we expect from budgets from a distributive standpoint? That was the normal thing we did. The other one, we will talk about the budget. How does the budget talk about the allocative functions of budgets, meaning you allocate resources to develop the country in a particular way? And lastly, budgets were supposed to be able to stabilize the economy. A bit about this and to talk in a sense, as we used to say, the kids used to say, where are we coming from? I think that will give us, some framework for discussion.
Deon, up to you.
Well, Ravi has pointed us in a particular direction. I think it's instructive in terms of dealing with budgets. In dealing with the question of ethnic relations and budgeting, if we are to use that framework, it will bring us to a point where we have to evaluate in terms of distribution, the allocation of resources. How do we see that the allocations? People are talking about the fact that infrastructure seems to be the major premise of the budget, the foundation of the budget, as against things like education and so on. So we are looking at a budget that is focused on physical development, in a sense, as against human development. The two may be connected, but Ravi, in talking about, in his introduction, added a kind of a human face to the question of budgeting. How do we see the budget in relation to humanity and this whole idea of making us this Dubai, this country with this grandiose infrastructure and all of these things? How do they relate?
Before the panels address that, I should point out that while infrastructure has the bulk of, well, not the bulk, but a substantial amount of the funding, there is distribution in health and education and in other sectors as well, in all fairness, housing and so forth. So it would be fair to say that most of it is in infrastructure, and I think the budget is well rounded. The question then really is the distributive aspect of the budget, the allocation aspect of the budget, and I think that's where the discussion should.
No, well, I would leave that to the panelists. Dr. Hinds, what do you think? We're not hearing you.
Your mute is on, Dr. Hinds.
Let me take off from where Ravi left, and I'm going to introduce the I word, ideology. Do you accept that the generation of wealth is driven by the private sector? Or do you accept that the real engine to generate national wealth lies with labor? we go back to that old fundamental question. And I think the answer to that question will determine the content and the reach of your budget. So the distributive and the allocative will arise from the ideological. How do you answer that question? Or if you say that it is inevitable in 2023, in the world that we live in, that one must center the private sector. How does your ideological gaze allow you to center the private sector while preserving the integrity of labor? So are you going to balance the promotion of capital as the means to distribute and allocate? Or are you going to balance that with labor? And I think when I look at this budget, I see no philosophical and ideological underpinning. I see a cobbling together of numbers. Now, is that to say that there is no expectation on the part of those who have put together this budget? I think there is an expectation. And there is where we get to the subtext of the budget. If the budget is the text, what is the subtext of this budget? What is this budget end of 2020 to do? We hear the word transformation. The budget is a transformative budget. So no budget is transformative. A budget is a budget. Could the budget lead to transformation? I think that's the fundamental question here. Could the budget lead to a kind of development that then in the medium term lead to a transformation of the society? I searched this budget. I searched this budget and I searched on the budget looking for an hint of some kind of national philosophical view of where. Now, if we accept the one Guyana mantra as the ideological gaze of the, does this budget in any serious and fundamental way speak to one Guyana? All right, so I am not going to say whether the budget is a good or bad budget. I think depending on where you come from, you will answer that question. And where I am coming from, that is, I am looking at the relationship between the particular, whether that particular is the ethnic group, or that particular is the social group, or that particular is one gender or the other. I am looking for the relationship between the particular and the general outcomes that you expect to get. And those general outcomes ostensibly should be national outcomes. I'm searching the budget, looking for those things. I'm not finding it. Yes, you're spending a lot of money on infrastructure. Well, fair enough, fair enough. But in our society, who benefits from that expenditure on infrastructure? Where that capital, where those resources, where that money is going to end up as you build the infrastructure? Are you in centering infrastructure? Are you playing in to the already sore question of the distribution of wealth in our society? Those of us whose memory go back to the 1957-64 PPP government, remember the PPP centered agriculture. And that centering of agriculture, the PPP soon learned, had ethnic consequences that may have contributed tremendously to the removal of the PPP from government in the 1960s. Have they learned?
Dr. Blackman, your view?
In this, it's quite interesting. Dr. Hinds and I agree, are aligned on this point in a very important way. So, as part of preparation for for our conversation here this evening, I too sought to try to discern some overarching. What is the animating idea behind the budget? What is, so if we think of a budget, we want to think of its alignment with some national development priorities. And so the question was, okay, what is the overarching national development philosophy that we're engaged in that is then reflected in this budget that would derive some particular outcomes? And I have to confess that this is in a sense its broad weakness. It does read as was just expressed as something that is sort of in a way cobbled together without a kind of overarching plan. So, as has been noted, we have increases in the monthly income tax threshold, increases, and we'll talk about maybe this in detail, increases in old age pension, investments that go to access to water, investments in health, the building out of hospitals, a huge investment, a huge kind of one of our largest sort of allocations this year is in education. There are some national security allocations. There's an allocation for power generation, and this is something that this is something that goes to the blackout that Ravi just experienced. But again, one cannot find a through line. It says, here's what our budget is about. As Dr. Hinds just noted, our budget is the One Guyana budget. What I actually went back to was to say, and I was glad that Ravi raised this in the sense of, in the 70s, it was this clear kind of mantra: everyone wanted to feed, clothe, and house a nation. And I actually thought that a lens through which to view the budget would have been through sort of, the broadly articulated sort of low carbon development strategy. And on the flip side, I thought that this, in a sense, could be twinned with the green state strategy, which was a part of the, So I think both political parties have sort of, in a way, articulated on one side, the green state development strategy, and on the other side, this sort of low carbon development strategy. So in a sense, I was looking for that lens through which to view the budget. And in that respect, one of the things that I was sort of looking for were, what are the investments that we've made in, our broad environmental and or environmental sort of resilience and adaptability. And I must confess, perhaps I need to read some more, but there's not enough there to sort of say, well, this is where we're landing. So I do think that this is a weakness of, what is the animating idea, and in the absence of a cohesive animating idea, I think what we're left with is a set of policy programs that are sort of cobbled together. And maybe this is good. Maybe it's good to have this sort of just pragmatic approach. Let's just plug the holes where we see them and hope something emerges in the future. But I must confess tonight I'm quite aligned with Dr. Hinds on this particular point of a cohesive rationale for the budget process, for the way in which the budgets, the way in which the allocations are made, and an understanding that there are a set of outcomes that we're looking for at the end of the year 2023. Yes.
Okay. Dr. Bisram, sorry for not treating you as a panelist tonight. For some balance.
But that's quite all right. I think Professor Blackman used a key word there. To me, it's a pragmatic budget. there has been an increment in allocation of practically every area. Now, Dr. Hinds made reference specifically to infrastructure. You see, infrastructure is very, very key to development. Regardless of what you would like to see at the end of the year, unless you have proper infrastructure, there cannot be any kind of development. There cannot be human development. There cannot be physical development. So infrastructure is key to all in development within the country. And in the long run, if done properly, the infrastructure would lead to a better standard of living for everyone. People will spend less time traveling to work, commuting to work. People will have more time for themselves, and so on and so forth. And that will lead to a cleaner environment as well. So while we may be critical of the amount of money going into infrastructure, we must look that Guyana is just now emerging out of poverty. And therefore it has to spend considerable amount of money on infrastructure.
Mr. Dev, in light of what Dr. Hinds has said in relation to, you set the tone for a focus based upon a kind of ideology, feed, clothes, and house the nation, and so on. And Dr. Blackman also focused in on the idea of low carbon and so on. Dr. Bisram is saying that infrastructure is critical, but Dr. Hinds, in zeroing in on infrastructure, added the ethnic component to it in a subtle manner, because he is, I'm suggesting, hinting to the fact that a lot of the monies for infrastructure will be targeting a particular group within the society. How do you see that as establishing, and he related to the 1953 PPP situation scenario? How do those factors? You
see, this is exactly why you have this rancor in Parliament. If we keep on trying to score points, that's how we'll end up. You know, I introduced the feed, house, and clothes budget as an illustration, you get me, of a budget that has a particular focus, and then we can agree or disagree about that. But if we start to talk about the 1957-64 PPP budgets and its orientation to agriculture, then one is forced to talk about the PNC's de-emphasis on agriculture, destruction of rice, destruction of sugar, destruction of everything. And where do you go from that? I simply was using it in an illustrative manner. I want to come back to that whole point, because I do see, and that is why I introduced the notion of the premises of neoliberalism, which has now swept the world and has become normalized. Even in countries that we believe, for example, the Nordic countries, they always come out on top of the happiness charts. They were considered social democrats, and you know, they had a particular view of feeding, housing, clothing, and all the other things that we lauded. But yet, if you examine them since the 80s, even the Nordic countries have had to shift to this neoliberal paradigm in terms of how do you prioritize the state spending. So I would like to posit that what I discerned when I saw the budget, one may use the word pragmatism, but it's pragmatism towards a dominant ideology, even though it's not called ideology. And that's the beauty when something is hegemonic. You don't even see it. You see it as common sense, as Gramsci said, you know. And so right now, what is that paradigm I see that the budget is within? You see, when you put together this budget, when you take the emphasis on infrastructure, in terms of infrastructure benefits individuals, of course, but it benefits businesses even more so. So if we talk of a road to Brazil, I'm going to be schlepping to Lethem with my car possibly, but I'll tell you what, it'll facilitate shipping of Brazilian products through our northern border to Europe and Africa and America. So there are developmental implications for the infrastructure. The bridge, and Mr. Burnham always talked about it, the Demerara Bridge integrated Region 3, where I'm at, into Region 4. And so therefore products could be shipped across our, agricultural products and what have you to border markets and elsewhere. So there are implications, and the implications are more so for the business community. So what we see in this budget, not only in terms of the infrastructure that will benefit businesses, we see the direct tax laws in terms of lowering of taxes to facilitate the opening of businesses. We see the focus on this gas to shore or gas to factory generation at Wales there, which is supposed to bring electricity to 5 US cents per kilowatt hour, which of course will help all of us. Me, for sure, my wife wouldn't have to use all my pension to pay the light bill, but will help to bring in, encourage businesses to set up, because we've always been uncompetitive with Trinidad, where electricity was 7 US cents for the longest while, and they could manufacture. That's why they have the greatest manufacturing base in the Caribbean. So I could go forward. You're talking of the diversification of agriculture. They have a program for that. That is good. Soya, you're talking of food insecurity in the world, apart from our own Caribbean need to cut the food bill. It's all over. So you have soya being planted. You have corn being planted, tested up in Takama and over there. You have all these fancy things that we are now used to. My wife today cook, a little broccoli, poor estate country boy, well, you know about broccoli in the past, but now our taste buds have gotten used to it. I understand we are getting cauliflower and all of that and broccoli. The point I want to make is that when I look at the budget, I saw this pragmatism in trying to deal with the imperatives of a neoliberal economy and our ground reality. I think where we can differ is the amount of focus. So as a pensioner, I would have wished that they would have given a bit more to pensioners. So we can differ on the amounts, but I think the framework is just as the Nordic countries have done. They always had all these support systems. They call themselves welfare states. So they have had to adjust to that. They haven't discarded all of those things. So when I heard about UG becoming free, not in this budget, but by 2025, those also hint to us that there are concerns about social development also. So that's how I would like to talk. And if you can continue to talk along these lines, maybe we can get somewhere without going back. I did it and you didn't do it, that kind of thing.
Dr. Hinds.
Well, Ravi has described me in the past as a memory warrior, and I plead guilty. I think history, especially for certain groups that have undergone certain unique experiences over centuries. You can't say to Black people anywhere in the world that have undergone 300 years of enslavement that they must not look back. They must always look back, and they will always look back. And so when one comes to a conversation that has to do with the interests of those people, yes, in a multi-ethnic society, the multi-ethnic society must get used to the gaze of history by the darkest among them. And I dare say that even East Indians and Chinese and Portuguese who came later themselves must have a gaze of history. It's going to be different because that unique experience of enslavement says that the rhetoric and the thought process, collective and individual, that comes out of that experience must confront these matters so that we talk about neoliberalism. This is not neoliberalism in America. This is neoliberalism in a multi-ethnic society in which the ethnic groups are at war. And so that it's neoliberalism within the context of ethnic domination. And when one group wants to dominate, there is going to be a response by the other group that also would want to dominate. So I'm not laying things on one group. domination leads to counter-domination. So one has to talk about neoliberalism within a particular context. Yes, the Nordic countries and their experience. We are not a Nordic country. Our experiences are completely different. And so therefore, when one is talking about a budget almost $1 trillion, don't place more to it. There's no pragmatism there. Pragmatism suggests a certain order. The budget is more eclectic than pragmatic, all right? And so therefore, one has to ask these questions. Have the people who put the budget together, they ask themselves, what is the outcome? Now, infrastructure. The early independence leaders, from Burnham to Manley, to Williams, they had an infrastructural gaze. At the end of 3 decades after independence, Barbados, while they were spending on infrastructure, Barbados was spending on education. When you compare Barbados to Guyana and the rest of them, after 3 or 4 decades of independence, we saw where Barbados was far ahead. So one must ask in this post-plantation society, with its ethnic tensions, now that you've put your hand on some resources, how are you going to clinically deal with the distributive aspect of those resources? You have poverty that is officially at 40%. It may be over 50. And you are putting together a budget and you are telling me what pragmatism? If you solve the problem of poverty, you also not only solve problems of education and problems of health and problems of the social development of people, you could also put a dent on the ethnic conflict in the society. Why are you, a post-plantation society with money in hand, not tackling poverty, which is 50% and more? You can't be pragmatic about that. You have to be intentional about those things. You have to be intentional. Because when you deal with poverty, it allows you to surmount the ethnic problems. So that if you are dealing with cash transfers, as we you give while you're dealing with the distributive problems. And so therefore, I go back to the point that there can't be something in the budget for everybody. There has to be something in the budget that closes the gap between some bodies and other bodies. I continue to make the point that often we don't sing for the land and then the man. We sing for the man and hope that that will translate into singing for the land. All right? We have to tackle the problems that we can tackle easier than others. You can have the best infrastructure and you have a country of dunce people. Your infrastructure means nothing. At the end of the day, if development is about human beings, if transformation is about human beings, you must answer me how your infrastructure leads to a healing of the human spirit that has been battered by centuries of slavery and colonialism. The scars of bondage are fresh. And if you have money and you don't want to heal those scars, don't talk to me about development and transformation. Having said that, you are not going to spend $780 billion and don't have some positive outcomes. And the positive outcomes will come not because of the budget, but in spite of the budget, because it's money. When you throw $700-something billion in a small country like the Guyana, 250,000 people, there are going to be some positive outcomes. But I argue that those positive outcomes will not be because of some wonderful, grandiose ideas from the framers. It will come because you have plenty money in a small society, and you are going to have some positive outcomes. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there are not going to be positive outcomes from the budget, but I'm saying, what is your intentional? What is your intentional expectations when you are spending our money, all of our money, and some monies that are owed to us? African Guyanese paid reparations to the slave masters between 1830 and 1834 and 1838. They paid 28 million pounds because the British government had to pay 48 million pounds. The British government paid 20. And we in the Caribbean, all of our parents to pay 28 million. We owe that. Are you taking that into consideration when you're putting policies in your budget? Historical memory is important to the present as we deal with the windfall that we never expected.
Dr. Blackman, recently a group of African businessmen, Guyanese, black men from Guyana, met with the Minister of Public Infrastructure, Juan Ejil, and they met with him because they were seeking ways of having contracts in some way be given to black contractors, businessmen, and so on. Dr. Hinds again hinted in his discourse that infrastructure, with a majority of the expenditure, not the majority, but a significant chunk of the budget focused on infrastructure, that it's a means of channeling resources in a particular direction. He's asking who will benefit. Now, is it right that in a country that is ethnically diverse as Guyana, we have Amerindians, Portuguese, East Indians, and so on, that African businessmen should have to meet with a minister to say, look, we also need, how can you help us to get?
Well, I think in this context, the answer is yes, it is right. It is correct. And this is a very important, this is I think, at the heart of the matter in this moment. And it's in this context that I think Dr. Hinds's appeal to history is something that's important. Actually, let me just say one of the points that I made note of for our discussion was to sort of ask us to think about past budget performances as a way of providing us a lens for viewing this budget also. So it's vitally important that we take the history that is a part of Guyana into consideration, right? So our initiative here is broadly an effort to promote unity through the understanding between different ethnic groups in Guyana. We've suffered. Ethnic relations is a sensitive issue, and we really need this kind of ongoing effort to promote greater understanding, cooperation between different groups, and we understand that this question that has been raised: who benefits from a large investment on the part of the state in infrastructure? And that is a legitimate question for us to address within the context of this program, which kind of looks at the intersection between ethnic relations, or which attempts to look at the intersection between ethnic relations and the budget. And so now I get back to the question of the Afro-Guyanese businessmen meeting with the minister of. I think this is entirely appropriate, and there ought to have been, given the sort of sensitivities in this context, one should expect to see sort of initiatives that are also a part of the budget, not just spending on the infrastructure, but also spending on developing the Afro-Guyanese business sector that would be necessary, that the development that is necessary for them to participate to meaningfully participate. You know, I think recently there was a kind of a study, set of PowerPoint presentation that was circulated widely on the internet, and it started off by saying, no Afro-Guyanese group has been awarded oil block, and then it went through contracts procurement contracts on various projects, and sort of identified the names of the owners of the businesses, and kind of posited that. And I think this is important for broad understanding, but I also think there ought to be some recognition. And in one case, I think I read someplace where, there were, 8 or 10 people who bidded for the contracts, and none of the people who bidded for the contracts were Afro-Guyanese firms. So in a sense, there is a genuine issue of the paucity of Afro-Guyanese firms that can meaningfully participate in some aspects of the infrastructure project. And so if one wants to allay suspicions, if one wants to, to say that this is a part of a broader, as one Guyana strategy where we're looking to lift all of the boats, then there ought to be concomitant resources for the development of this sector, access to capital for Afro-Guyanese businesses, etc. So I think, yes, it was vitally important that the businessmen meet with the Minister of Infrastructure to ask about ways in which they can meaningfully participate in the sector. And I think there's also a kind of reciprocal obligation on the part of the government, in the interest of the broad One Guyana, looking forward, as Ravi has tried to direct us, that you have to think in a very serious way and a rigorous way about how you do this. And this is not something that's new. Here in New York, there are, if one deals with the state, there are a number of provisions that are made for small and minority-owned businesses. So this is something that really ought to be aligned with the broad infrastructure spend, and it's something that we as a group should be saying. If our task is to proactively point out where potential pitfalls in the road exist in this broad sort of ethnic racial dimension, then this is certainly one of them, and it's entirely appropriate for us for this issue to be raised about who benefits, and when we say that within this ethnic context, we are asking broadly which ethnic group will benefit from on average more from a huge investment in infrastructure. Let me say this, I have long thought that we should invest a tremendous amount of money in, we should invest in our electricity. We should invest in our water. We should invest in our roads. We should invest in our schools. We should invest in our hospitals. So I'm not at all, saying that these investments ought not to be made. They ought to be made. Part of what I'm trying to do is to help to contextualize the discussions as we make these investments, given the history of tension between our racial groups, and the fact that we need to think about how to promote greater understanding, that we ought to be mindful of how these investments are being, in a way, how they're being distributed, it's kind of Ronald Reagan world. We don't want the trickle-down economics. We've seen that it doesn't quite work. And so we want to think more affirmatively about the kind of economics that ought to be practiced in a relatively small place like Guyana with less than 1 million people. So that would be my response to the question.
Before you speak, the Amerindians also have complained that, and the one Amerindian rights activist in the news this evening is asking if the budget is focused on buying votes because they have land issues that are still unresolved, and they're saying that the government is not preventing encroachment upon their lands and so on. So apart from the Africans, the Amerindians also have.
If you might permit me one thought,
in relation to issues. How do you, in light of what Dr. Blackman, Dr. Hinds, Mr. Dev, what they have said, how do you relate these to the budget in terms of ethnic considerations?
Let me let Professor Blackman make his point.
I just wanted to say that I just recently wrote a short article about this in relation to thinking that the 750 million paid by Hess for carbon credits. And I had the opportunity to talk with the former Minister for Amerindian Affairs, Sidney Alcock. And this was precisely part of the conversation that we had and part of what we wrote, which was the necessity for a meaningful collaboration. And one of the proposals that he made, he thought that there should be an Amerindian bank to provide access to capital for Amerindians that emerge from this, and training and this sort of thing, so as to be able to seed Amerindian businesses that could play a meaningful role in. So it's not dissimilar, this conversation that we're having in relation to, Afro-Indo-Guyanese, but also Amerindians are part of this process and need to be considered. There ought to have also been a group of Amerindian businessmen visiting with the Minister of Infrastructure to talk about ways in which Amerindians could also be a part of the broad thrust of the investment in infrastructure.
Before Vishnu, before you go, in fairness to the government, there is an allocation for Amerindian development. You can quarrel with its size, you can quarrel with the objective behind it, what kind of outcomes, whether it's a buy vote or not, but there is an allocation for Amerindian development in the budget. Just wanted to point that out.
Okay. The assumption being made is that the primary beneficiary of the government, let's just focus on infrastructure development, will be East Indians. It may be so. I don't know, because we don't know what
the East Indian business class.
Okay, so probably yes, but David, I mean, if it's the East Indian business class who are putting in bids for contracts, I mean, you can't blame them. You can't blame the government if they are the only ones who are. As Professor Black,
you can't blame the government. Well, the government has a responsibility to use the budget to ensure that they're Black and Amerindian bidders. Where is the investment? Well, in the Black private sector, the Amerindian private sector.
I agree. Professor Blackman did point out that there should be some kind of arrangement made for loans, to empower Black entrepreneurs as well. But look, we tend to forget that historically, development in Guyana, infrastructure development, has been focused around African areas and the urban areas. Now, up until today, this day, if you travel around throughout Guyana, in rural areas, there are hardly any passable roads. I mean, if you go to some area, you have if they build a road, it will just be for one vehicle to pass at a time. No, a second vehicle can go side by side. So the rural areas, the hinterland areas, have been neglected historically. So if government is now focusing on building roads and infrastructure development in the hinterland areas and in the rural areas, it would be appropriate at this particular time, given that the urban areas have pretty good infrastructure ways. I mean, waterway and so on and so forth.
Before Ravi, before you get into the debate, I mean, Vishnu has made a point that it's the Indian contractors and so on who are bidding for contracts. That is not entirely true. In fact, what happens now is that Indian businessmen who want to have contracts, many of them do not even have the technical know-how, but they use their names to bid for the contracts the proposals and everything are written up by black contractors, and the team that works on the contract would be the black men who are really the and this is happening. I know several instances of, because if the black contractors are to bid for those contracts, they're not going to get them. They're not going to get it. So the name of an Indian is used and the work is done by African Guyanese. Yes, Ravi, go ahead.
Now, this is the most ridiculous statement I could ever make. And I don't normally speak in this tone, but I just want to say that. Here you have a bidding process. The bidding process, you're saying that there are African businessmen who are qualified to make those bids. But they're being employed. Let me finish, man.
Go ahead.
I've been sitting here for 20 minutes without talking. You're saying that they now are being hired by an Indian just for his name. But when those bids are opened up, there is nothing to say that if those black contractors had bid and they made an appropriate bid, whether by cost or whatever criteria they're using, then they would have gotten the bid. The whole point is that those black businessmen have to make those bids. So that's number one. Number two, let's talk about financing. You talk about these 300 business African, they call themselves black. Well, Eric Phillips and others back in the previous administration had formed an African business roundtable with a whole host of goals and objectives, and they put it to the previous government. And some of them had to be done by themselves. You had, for example, you talk about a bank. That was part of the African Business Roundtable goals. Now, to have a bank in Guyana, the criteria is very clear. You have to have X amount of capital. It used to be 200 million. You have to have a certain number of people who are qualified, and you go through these hoops because people are applying for banking licenses every day of the year. I know of 4 Jamaican companies we now have a merchant bank to an African businessman out of Washington, right? The point is therefore, and this is, I come back to the framework, in a neoliberal economy, right? The premises are that the engine of growth is the private sector. And therefore, groups have to get themselves ready to be able to participate in that. I have always said that, as a caveat, my own personal predilection was that if groups have been historically discriminated against in particular areas of endeavor, there ought to be affirmative action programs. But that's a whole nother thing. In 1988, Mr. Hoyt made a presentation as president to the 150th anniversary of the abolition of African slavery.
That's history,
he called it Beyond the Horizon. And he said that African Guyanese have to look beyond the horizon. The economists talk about deferred gratification. How do you build capital and all of that? And go back and read that speech of Mr. Hoyt. And I always say I spent a tremendous amount of time with Mr. Hoyt. And for instance, he told me, and I think I've referred to this on this program before, that he convinced Barama, when they brought in their plywood factory, not to locate it in the Northwest District where the wood was coming from, but to locate it on the East Bank so that African Guyanese could get employment. And he told me, and he smiled when he said it, he said, Ravi, at Friday night, you ought to see people jumping the fence to go to dance and play out. Now, if an Indian said it, he'll be like, you're being racial. But the point is that there are many factors which militate against African Guyanese from participating in these areas. And I alluded in my column last week and in my letters to George Lamming's summary of what that means in terms of them being ready, coming out of slavery. He critiqued the focus on education and not to get their hands dirty. Alarming words, you know, in his preface to Walter's book, History of the Guyanese Working People. I mean, you know, we could go down, but that's going down a rabbit hole. Well, David talks about history. What is the history of development in the third world, of which we were part and parcel coming out of colonialism? And I can point you that the only countries that developed and pulled themselves up and beyond are those countries that were able, that in the initial stage of growth, were able, as we Guyanese say, to ban your belly and forget whatever circumstances you're in, and you work hard, and you will take those opportunities and you will progress. And I quoted on this program, then I quoted in my paper, that was how the first generation of African Caribbean people to the United States, that's how they outperformed African Americans, because the Caribbean people followed Booker T. Washington's dictum to say, drop your bucket where you are, meaning in whatever situation you find yourself, you work very hard, and you will move out of that. And I've always said this. Again, I never like to speak for African Guyanese because, like I said, you know, there are certain peculiar features that I have not lived experience. But coming back to quoting Booker T versus W.E.B. Du Bois, I think there has to be a balance between the agitation and setting down your buckets and working from where you are. So again, to come back to history, look at what they call the far eastern tigers, who they said if they were the flying geese. They took the lead of Japan, and they had a strategy for development. And in the initial stages, you know, you could not believe the privations that they had to go through. And when America developed in 100 years from the beginning of industrialization to where they are, they took 50, and China took 25. Why? Because it was the same principle. Deng took neoliberal principle, and whereas Chinese were working 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, but look where they are today. I am saying that we can always criticize and say this or that, but here is a budget. And I will criticize the budget, but here is a budget that you can't have everything done in 1 year or in 2 years or in 3 years. We have to look at the fundamentals of the budget, and will it lead to an outcome where there will be an opportunity to distribute. And this was Mr. Burnham's fundamental error. In hindsight, it's great to look at it, but it is, which is you must first produce before you can distribute. Because if you take what is coming in and you spend it now, then, you know, there's the old thing, one of these days you look to the rock for rescue, but there'll be no rock. The money will be gone. Where do we now start? I am saying, here's a budget. You have, I think, 90 billion for education. Here's a budget for health. You have, again, umpteen tens of billions. Here's a budget for the Amerindians. You have that solar electrification program. Here is a budget that regionally you have development in all of the areas. Here is a budget that at least is the beginning. Now, we may critique, as David alluded to in another sense, how much of each, right? I happen to feel there should be a bit more focus on the distributive aspects. But you cannot just only focus on that. How do we ever get going on a path of growth? We got to tie our belly right now. And our task, I believe, is to ensure that this government, you know, has transparency, has commitment, because you first will reform, but then you have to transform. And before we have the transformation, you get me, there must be all of these things in place where we can keep our eyes on them and hold their feet to the fire. But let us not talk about only distribution and distribution and distribution. You know, we have to build something solid.
I don't mind you casting aspirations on what I said about the contractors, because I know
aspersions,
aspersions, not aspiration. Because I know it's a fact, and the fact that African businessmen have to meet with the minister to lay their concerns should point to the fact. You are basically
those businessmen were founded only last year by the Americans. I come back and told in the same meeting where David poo-pooed my talk about American intervention. That association was fostered by the American USI bigwig who came down, and they sponsored that to get African Guyanese on that path. And I'm so happy that you have 300 of them, and they said there are 300 in England, and great. So the point is, what has the African Guyanese community not been putting together their resources to do this thing? For example, that bank that Eric had said they would have. They would create before the 5 years. Why don't we have an African bank? Who do we blame for that? Was there an application? I know there was no application.
David, you're...
Look, no ethnic group, no group, any part of the world, no country, any part of the world, from Singapore to the Far East, as you call them, they did not, quote unquote, develop without state facilitation. The United States did not get where it got without the states sponsoring development. This thing that, you know, people can just uplift themselves, you know? And we put that burden on Black people. They're not doing certain things. They're doing certain things in Nigeria. They may be doing it wrong, but they're entrepreneurs in Nigeria and Kenya. There's nothing essentially wrong. There's nothing essentially wrong. There's nothing essentially wrong with people. They were the original entrepreneurs in Guyana. They were the original. How they went from doing an almost a miracle after they got out of slavery to where they are now. Because they're lazy. Because they're jumping over fences. No, they got there because of government policy. And they're going to get out of it through government policy. You walk around this place and see Black people sleeping on stalls at the night at big market, trying to do little business. They're doing the fundamentals of business, but they're starting way behind others. And nobody is correcting that. We're expecting people who start in the game 40 years ago, and those who are starting now to have the same outcomes. No, Ravi. No. The state, the government, they have a responsibility to ensure racial and social equality in the fundamental right. And East Indians did not rise in business because they're better business people. They were sponsored by the state. The state sponsored Portuguese and Chinese.
That's not accurate, David. And
why look, you telling me it's not accurate?
David, let me give you an example. My mother-in-law had a stall in Stabrook Market in the 1940s, 50s. Get me? The Biharis had a stall. Matais had a stall. They used to import spices and they used to grind the spice and sell it to the same big market, right? Old man Bihari took it upon himself to then go to on a bigger scale, right down Charlotte Street, and he started to, grind more spices on a larger scale, indi curry powder, named after his son, and all of that. And then one daughter happened to be in the United States, one of his daughters. She happened to end up in Wall Street. And she came back and got him into banking. The one I want to say is that let us not go down that rabbit hole, but I can, the same way you are doing, that I can show you almost every Indian business, you get me, there's a way of, I said, banding your belly and, deferred gratification, as Mr. Hoyt called it, and then you enter the open society based on either you combine your resources or you have resources. But you got to start somewhere. And I feel, and I'll be very blunt, David, if we constantly harp on our failures, you cannot achieve success on that way. We have to think positive. And I'm saying, what is the new model of development? The same thing, the government, let's take infrastructure. Let's take any road to be built. Then it means that African business people have, just like Indian business people, if they're conniving to hire these, and I'm sure that would have happened, but why is it that an African businessman cannot do the same conniving, get other Africans or even get Indian business people to put together a bid? And if the bid makes sense, it's an open process. Nobody, pulls out one bid. All of the bids are open in front of everybody. And we shall see. I'm saying we have to give the process a chance. And let us look forward. Let us be positive about it. To go back to talk about, of course, the Africans, and I've always maintained that the British destroyed the early village settlements in terms of vis-a-vis the Portuguese. And we know that. And I've always said that then deserves, in my book, a call for affirmative action in that community. But let's do it openly. And as Ipadaji said it was doing, let us now go forward and have programs. And I always come back to the RAID program, where the Granger administration picked 5 African Guyanese villages, historical villages, Ithaca, Mocha, Buxton, and BV, and had that $2.6 billion program, and it went forward. I just thought that was a model for Guyana in dealing with quote unquote depressed community. And I felt that could have been used in Indian communities too. So I am saying that here now, we are at the point where finally we got money coming in. And the money will be spent based on the ideology you have. And the dominant ideology we have now is the neoliberal one, where businesses will get force dibs at what's going on. And they talk about it openly. Everybody talks about business being the engine of growth. We ain't going to be able to change that paradigm. I think in Guyana, and this is where I support you, I think in Guyana, being cognizant of our own history, just like how the Nordic countries didn't jettison all of their welfare programs, we in Guyana ought to consciously, both sides, and put the PPP on the spot, that in those social programs where you have high levels of poverty, then more money ought to be directed there into those programs, right? I agree with that, but we must now argue the point not on sentiment, right? Because that's not what is going to run this world. It's going to be on cold, hard evidence. And as I said, we got to be evidentiary. So if we can show there was discrimination, for example, in credit, the whole thing though that the government does not allocate credit. It's a private function in a neoliberal economy. And what will happen? Events will fast overtake us there, unless we have a black bank right this minute. Because if you to form, because the part of neoliberalism is the financialization of the economy, where people in America don't make money planting corn and wheat. Some of them do, but it's in the speculation. More money is made by the speculators of corn and wheat. More money is, price of our oil is not necessarily demand and supply. It are speculators. This kid, Blackman Fried, could steal $22 billion, from what? Just playing with Bitcoins, So the point is a whole new thing, and it comes back to financialization. And to me, in this economy, if we're going to look for banks, if they're discriminated against black, like Mr. Campbell, I think, has said, the guy who owned the Mario's and
Terrence
all that.
Campbell, yes.
This is the case. And I think he should show chapter and verse and let us see if those things happen. I happened to try to look into it, and I checked out the credit offices of the major banks in Guyana, and all of them were of African descent. Now, it doesn't mean that African credit, owner wouldn't give black people or wouldn't be told. I'm not saying that. But I think he did a good thing to come out. But I'm saying, David, just like Yesu Prasad in 1994 started Demerara Bank. I had just come back. I had taken him to Gopio, and he came back, and I happened to deposit at that time a check in US, because at that time they wanted foreign funds. You didn't have a corresponding bank. And I had a fairly large check. I had sold a building I own in Jamaica, 172nd in Jamaica. So I deposited. So the point is, I know how these guys started, right? So coming back to it, David, I would say at this juncture, we have to empower African Guyanese to enter this neoliberal economy. You understand? And I'll stop with this. I've talked long.
Yeah,
when
because
I had a role,
Dr. Blackman has not spoken for quite a while.
When I had a role at Guyana Times in terms of reorganizing them, ask Eric Phillips this. I asked him for him to come and do a piece on entrepreneurship and to focus on building black entrepreneurship, starting with our A-level classes. Let's do all this, get away with all this history and all, not history, but other things. And let us focus in the black community on entrepreneurship. Sorry, there, Deon.
I know we only got 4 minutes. 30 seconds thing. Ravi, I would never sit there and say there's something about Indian people that they don't go in the army, and something about Indian people that they don't go in the police force, and something about Indian people that they're not teachers and they're not nurses.
It's historical.
It's historical, Ravi, and we have to treat it as that. I'm saying you can't want black people to protect the borders and saying that they must be in business. You can't want them to protect black rights. You can't want them to teach the children. You can't want them to nurse you back to health. And then saying, but not going into business.
David,
it's the way the economy developed that push them in those directions.
David, I'm saying we are working within
if the state wanted Indians to go in the army, they would have made it mandatory.
David,
the state didn't make it mandatory.
I'm talking you're working within a paradigm, boy, and all I'm saying is that we got to be cognizant of what we are working within, and we can carry on and do it. If you want to
carry on, is stating the fact.
So y'all are going to.
We have to protect your rights. We have to protect your borders. And you were saying that something wrong with me while we're not in business.
I never said that. I never said something. See, you're using value judgment. I'm saying nothing is wrong. I never used the word.
Dr. Blackman,
I see.
Wrong. Value judgment.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, doctor.
Come on, man.
So I
You'll
thought
have to tie up because we're running out of time.
Yeah, so perhaps I should go to where we started. We started this discussion with a question about the tone of the parliament. And and so I see that we finally found ourselves there. It's maybe not to do with the folks in Guyana at all, but maybe just
my apology.
Talking about
and I apologize on behalf of Ravi too.
Yeah, same here.
All right.
Now that we've addressed the question of the tone on this program, I wanted to just also on the lines that Dr. Hinds just raised. I think one of the things we have to be careful about are some of these sort of stereotypes as it relates to Afro-Guyanese participation in business, and some of the things that are easily bandied about, like this kind of penchant for instant gratification and the unwillingness to band the belly, and this kind of thing. I think it's actually not true at all. I mean, anyone who is familiar with the Afro-Guyanese experience knows that there is nothing but banding the belly. There is nothing but the foreign gratification. And there's somehow now a kind of education as kind of making your hands a little soft. And the point is, education is a vital function for a developing society. And there was a very strong effort made to educate themselves. My grandmother never went to school. and she learned how to read in the church, and there was a strong emphasis in our families about ensuring, and this has been a long thing. So I think we ought to be careful about how we, in a way, cast a negative aspersion on these on these functions, which are critical. I will try not to cast any aspersions in this matter, but education is important, and we ought not to diminish the value of education, particularly in the Guyanese culture, and to sort of somehow suggest that, Afro-Guyanese have chosen the sort of wrong path by not. And then I wanted to do just a little bit of history. As I was sitting here, my very first job was working as a passenger services agent for Guyana Airways in the mid-'80s. And I was just reflecting on the entrepreneurial activity that emerged, the traders who started to go through. This was a predominantly Black activity. And Black women going to Barbados, going to Trinidad, selling gold chains and prawns and bringing money back, and the whole place there around America Street. So I think we ought to, again, factually, the evidence does not suggest that somehow Afro business is an anathema to Afro-Guyanese. I think what we see is that there are some structural conditions that make it difficult to access finance, that make it difficult to build the kinds of businesses that can meaningfully compete in this environment. And it's for precisely this reason that you might end up in a bidding situation where all of the bidders who can meaningfully put bids in for building a 4-lane highway are builders who are Indo-Guyanese. But you then ask, well, back to the central question of our thing, the budget and its context within ethnic relations. We start from a position where people are suspicious of each other. We start from a position where there is this kind of ethnic contestation that is just beneath the surface. Let's just focus on our question of the infrastructure investment that the government is making. The government then has a right, then has a more than an obligation, but a responsibility to ensure that there is this broader narrative that the budget is a one Guyana budget. And we're saying we're going to spend lots of money on roads. We're going to spend lots of money in lots of different places. And we're going to ensure that all Guyanese participate in this investment that we're making, not just at the back end of the investment when the roads are built, but also in the economic activity that comes from building the roads. And then I wanted to end on one last thing. As I was sitting here, we talked last week about my father passing away. One of the projects that my father was intimately involved in was something called the Upper Mazaruni Road Development Project, which I'm sure that many of you guys, and I wanted to get a cautionary tale. In 1973, this was the election campaign of Forbes Burnham, that his administration would develop this large hydroelectric complex in the Upper Mazaruni region aimed at powering aluminum smelter to be built at Linden. At that time, we were spending 25% of our gross domestic product, about $500 million on fuel. This is 1973. And when we get done with this Upper Mazaruni project, it ends in 1984. The government of Guyana, after spending $1 billion on various aspects of the project, failing to acquire international financing, eventually decided not to proceed with it any longer. So we've built roads in our history, or tried to build roads and invested largely in roads. And so we should approach it in a way that is smart, and we should be open to criticisms that emerge. And we should also be thinking about ways in which we do it that are inclusive. And I leave that with you as my thought on the discussion this evening.
And on that note, I think we should end. But let me just make one final point, and which is, you see, government's responsibility is to provide equal opportunities for all. Its responsibility is not to provide equal outcome and equal results. That is your own individual initiative. And I think that is one of the mistakes that several people make. And I would like to leave it right here.
And before you end, let me make the point that, Ravi, it's good that you have come around to the point in a subtle way, saying that if we are going to if Indian and Africans can come together or work together to bid for these contracts, that is what they're doing. but they're doing it because of the nature of the economy, the nature of the country. The other thing is, the Minister of Agriculture is coming to Guyana. You talked about the RAID project. Mustafa is coming here tomorrow to distribute seeds. The African farmers, Buxton, I told you that Buxton was the example for the RAID project. We have plantains, we have bananas, we have all kinds of stuff at the back there. Getting them out to the market is the major problem. He's not coming to tell us about building a road like they did in Egg and all the other villages where Indian farmers can have tractors and everything go down to bring out their produce. We can't go
I'm telling you that's not true about Hague. I live next to Hague, man, and you still repeat that slander.
I'm telling you, I went all the way
down the back of years ago. Right now, the Namstel Road and you compare it to Hague Road. In fact,
that is not true. That is not true. Don't lie to me, man. Anyway, let's end the program because that's
anyway, it's going. Yeah, we are 8 minutes past the program.
That is not factual. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all for being on the program. It's been a pleasure being here again to have this kind of discussion. But I hope that the minister will come tomorrow and say he's going to build a road for the Buxtonians so that we can go down to the back dam and do what we have been known to do. Buxton had 11 bakeries owned by black people at one time. Right? So you can't, I mean, these things that you all are saying, there are reasons why they are where we are now.
And all of us know that. Okay then.
Good. So,
all right, guys. Good night.
Good night, guys.
Good night, gentlemen.
Good night, gentlemen.